romantically involved with Dumb and Dumber co-star Lauren Holly.
They say never meet your heroes, and for Dave Chappelle, meeting Jim Carrey was the perfect example. Dave's recent comments on Jim have gone viral, not because they're funny, but because they're brutally honest about what Jim was really like behind the scenes. It's a side of the story we haven't heard until now, and it changes everything we thought we knew about their relationship. Life in a Volkswagen. The homeless roots of Hollywood's funniest man. If you ask almost anyone to name one of the funniest, most wildly talented actors to ever exist, the answer comes easily: Jim Carrey. Not just because he was funny, but because of how he did it. The faces, the movement, the way his entire body seemed to become the joke before a single word even landed. It wasn't just comedy. It was something physical, something unpredictable, something that reshaped what people thought humor could look like. But for all that brilliance, there's another side that doesn't fit as neatly into that image. Because as much as audiences saw someone electric, those who crossed paths with him off-camera didn't always walk away with the same experience. And one of the people who saw that difference up close was Dave Chappelle. To really understand where that contrast begins, you have to go back to the start, long before the fame, before the reputation, to a version of Jim Carrey that looked nothing like the one the world would later come to know. James Eugene Carrey was born in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada, into a working-class family shaped by routine and quiet ambition. His mother, Kathleen, stayed home, while his father, Percy, moved between music and accounting, holding the household together as best as he could. It was a Catholic upbringing, steady on the surface, with 3 older siblings and a mix of Irish, Scottish, and French-Canadian roots running through the family. And even in that ordinary setting, something about him stood out early. At 8 years old, he was already drawn to the mirror, experimenting with his face, stretching expressions, testing how far he could go before it turned into something funny. That curiosity didn't stay small for long. By 10, he had written to Carol Burnett, convinced he had already mastered impressions and deserved a spot on her show. When a reply came back, even if it was just a standard response, it was enough to make it feel real. But as his imagination was growing, his family's situation was quietly falling apart. They moved from Scarborough to Burlington, trying to stay stable, but eventually, stability slipped out of reach. At one point, they lost their home entirely, forcing all of them into a Volkswagen van, while teenage Jim and his brother spent months sleeping in a tent at Charles Daly Park by Lake Ontario. That period didn't just pass, it settled into him. When his father found work again at a tire factory in Scarborough, it came with a condition. The family could stay in a nearby house, but Jim and his brother had to earn it, working long overnight shifts as janitors and security guards, moving through 8-hour nights that stretched into the early morning. It was repetitive, draining, and far removed from anything that looked like a dream. Still, even in that routine, something kept pulling him back. After moving again, he attended Agincourt Collegiate Institute, but by 16, he walked away from school entirely, choosing instead to step into comedy, performing in downtown Toronto while still tied to factory work. And even then, the possibility of a different life never felt too far away. He once admitted that if things had gone differently, he could easily see himself working in a steel mill in Hamilton, looking out across Burlington Bay at the same factories he once believed held the best jobs anyone could hope for. But that path didn't take him. He kept moving, carrying everything with him: the struggle, the pressure, the need to become something else. And somewhere in that journey, the version of Jim Carrey the world would celebrate began to take shape. Beyond the Booze: Lessons from the Basement of Yuck Yucks. By the time Jim Carrey first stepped onto a stage in 1977, he wasn't walking in alone. He was 15, nervous, still figuring himself out. And right beside him was his father, helping him put together something that looked like an act. That night, they drove into downtown Toronto to a small comedy spot called Yuk Yuk's, a one-night-a-week club tucked inside the basement of a community center. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't forgiving, and it wasn't built for someone still finding their voice. Everything about that first performance felt slightly off. His outfit, a polyester leisure suit chosen by his mother, carried a kind of optimism that didn't match the room. The material he brought with him, built around safe, conventional impressions, didn't land the way he hoped it would. The audience was rough, leaning toward a sharper, more adult kind of humor. And within minutes, the gap between who he was and what they expected became impossible to ignore. The set fell apart, and just like that, doubt crept in. Not the kind that fades overnight, but the kind that lingers, quietly asking whether this path was ever really his. That moment didn't exist in isolation. It sat alongside everything his family was already dealing with. Money was tight, stability was fragile, and chasing a career in entertainment didn't exactly feel practical. For a while, it seemed easier to step back than to push forward. But time changed things. The family's situation improved just enough for them to move into a new home in Jackson's Point. And with that small sense of stability came a return to the stage. By 1979, Carrey was no longer the same unsure teenager. The act had sharpened, the confidence had grown, and when he landed a paid 20-minute set at a club in Scarborough, earning $20 Canadian, it felt like more than just money. It felt like proof that something was beginning to work. And once that door cracked open, he didn't hesitate. He went back to the same place that had broken him 2 years earlier. Yuk Yuk's, now relocated to Bay Street in Yorkville. This time, it was different. The same room that once rejected him became the place where he started to build something real. Open mic nights turned into paid sets, and paid sets turned into a growing reputation. At 17, he wasn't just trying anymore. He was becoming someone people were starting to notice. That momentum carried him into bigger ambitions. He began pushing toward sketch comedy, aiming for a spot on Saturday Night Live during the 1980 to 81 season. It was a long shot, and it didn't work out. The show went in a different direction, choosing someone else, and Carrey was left to regroup. Instead of breaking through, he found himself taking smaller opportunities, including voice work on a local overnight program, keeping himself in motion while trying to figure out the next step. But momentum doesn't always move in a straight line. In early 1981, at 19, he was booked to open for the rock band Godot at a theater in Barrie. It should have been another step forward, but the crowd wasn't there for comedy, and they made that clear. He was booed off stage. He didn't return for the second show. And yet, almost immediately, something changed again. Just 2 weeks later, a review of his performance at Yuk Yuk's appeared in the Toronto Star, complete with a photo of him mid-impression. The review didn't just praise him, it declared that a real star was starting to take shape. That kind of recognition changed everything. Suddenly, there was demand. Not just in Toronto, but across Canada. From there, the pace picked up. In April 1981, he appeared on an evening at the Improv, stepping into a wider spotlight. That same year, he landed his first acting role in a television film, playing a struggling impressionist comic, a role that mirrored his own life more closely than it seemed. As the film reached audiences across the country, his name carried further, settling into places it hadn't reached before. The next breakthrough came through Rodney Dangerfield, who saw something in him and brought him on tour as an opening act. That exposure pushed Carrey beyond Canada, placing him in front of new audiences, new expectations, and new opportunities. By the end of 1981, there was already talk of him crossing into the American scene, with interest building around a possible appearance on The Tonight Show. He chased that opportunity too, auditioning for the show in 1982, but once again, the door didn't fully open. Instead, he was told to keep refining his act. So he went back, not defeated, but sharper, continuing to build the following he had already created. That same year, he returned home to Toronto and performed 2 sold-out shows at Massey Hall, a clear sign that whatever path he was on, it was moving forward. And when it finally broke open in the 1990s, it didn't happen quietly. Films like Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber didn't just succeed, they exploded, turning him into one of the most recognizable faces in the world. That run continued with Batman Forever, The Cable Guy, and Liar Liar, each role pushing his energy further, making it clear that his style wasn't a phase, it was a force. But even then, he didn't stay in one place. With The Truman Show and Man on the Moon, he moved into something deeper, something more controlled, earning critical recognition and proving that what he had wasn't limited to comedy. It expanded again with How the Grinch Stole Christmas and Bruce Almighty, balancing commercial success with performances that kept audiences watching closely. By the time he stepped into Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, something had changed again. The performance felt quieter and more internal, and it landed with a kind of weight that stayed long after the film ended. That same year, he was inducted into Canada's Walk of Fame, a full-circle moment that connected everything back to where it started. The years that followed didn't slow him down. They just changed the way he showed up. From voice roles in Horton Hears a Who, to darker, more complex parts in I Love You, Philip Morris, and even returning to familiar territory with Dumb and Dumber 2, he kept moving, adjusting, and evolving. Television followed with Kidding, where the line between performance and personal unraveling blurred in a way that felt almost too real. And even as time passed, he kept finding new ways to reappear, stepping into political satire on Saturday Night Live, then into the role of Dr. Robotnik in Sonic the Hedgehog, carrying that same unpredictable energy into a new generation. At one point, he spoke openly about stepping away, about feeling both exhausted and fulfilled by everything he had done. It sounded final, like the closing of a chapter. But even that didn't hold for long, because in 2024, he returned again, stepping back into the same role, the same chaos, the same presence that had defined him for decades. The Ace of Hearts, the King of Solitude, Jim Carrey's search for stillness. For someone who built a career on making people laugh, the personal life of Jim Carrey has always carried a very different tone beneath the surface. Because behind the energy, the fame, and the characters that felt larger than life, there's a pattern that keeps repeating itself, one that doesn't always end the way people expect. It starts in 1993, at a time when everything in his career was beginning to take off, but his personal life was already starting to shift. That was the year his marriage to Melissa Wummer came to an end. 6 years together, a child between them, and a history that stretched back to a time before the world knew his name. She had been there through the uncertainty, through the grind, through the years when success still felt far away. And that kind of history doesn't just fade quietly. But the way it ended made it harder to ignore. Wimmer later revealed that the breakup didn't come with warning signs. From where she stood, everything had seemed fine, steady even, until he left to film Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. That moment became a dividing line, the point where everything began to unravel. And as the timing unfolded, another name entered the picture: Lauren Holly. Carrey had met Holly during the audition process, and from the outside, the overlap raised questions that were difficult to dismiss. It led to suspicions of infidelity, a belief that something had shifted before the marriage had officially ended. Holly would later push back on that narrative, insisting that by the time their relationship began, the marriage was already over in everything but name. Still, the way Weimer saw it carried a different weight. She described the moment he stepped onto that set, not just as an actor stepping into a role, but as a man stepping into a new version of himself. One who wanted to experience success without the ties of the life he had before. And yet, that version didn't last long either. By 1996, Carrey had married Holly, his co-star in Dumb and Dumber, but within less than a year, that marriage collapsed too. By July 1997, divorce papers had already been filed, and what had once looked like a fresh start quickly became another ending. The reason, at least in part, came down to pressure that didn't ease up. Holly later spoke about how the constant presence of paparazzi turned their lives into something unrecognizable. It wasn't just attention, it was intrusion. Photographers crossing boundaries, stepping onto private property, even going as far as digging through their trash. It created a kind of tension that didn't leave room for anything else. Instead of focusing on each other, they were constantly reacting, constantly trying to protect something that felt like it was slipping away. And once that marriage ended, the pattern didn't settle. It intensified. In 1999, Carrey began a relationship with Renee Zellweger, his co-star in Me, Myself, and Irene. It started quickly, almost unexpectedly. He was drawn to her almost immediately, while her feelings took longer to catch up. But when they did, the relationship found a rhythm that, at least on the surface, felt calm, even ordinary in a way that contrasted with everything around them. There was a sense of ease there, a life that, by description, felt stable. He saw her as something rare, someone grounded, someone genuine. But even that didn't hold. By December 2000, it ended, with both sides acknowledging that they simply wanted different things. Rumors followed, suggesting ultimatums and expectations that never aligned. But those were later dismissed, leaving behind a simpler truth that still carried its own weight. And then came one of his most visible relationships. In 2005, he met Jenny McCarthy, and this time, it seemed different again. Their connection extended beyond just the two of them, especially through McCarthy's son, Evan, whom Carrey supported closely. They shared beliefs, passions, and a public image that felt united. From the outside, it looked solid, consistent, even happy. Which is why, when it ended in 2010, it caught people off guard. After 5 years together, the announcement came quietly, almost simply, but it left behind a lot of unanswered questions. Those closer to them pointed to differences that had always been there. A contrast in how they approached life, attention, and the public eye. Where one leaned into visibility, the other seemed to pull away from it. And somewhere in that dynamic, something gave way. Descriptions of Carrey during that time painted a picture that wasn't easy to define. Someone capable of deep connection, of warmth and compassion, but also someone who could shift just as quickly in the opposite direction. A need for closeness that could, just as suddenly, turn into a need for distance. Not a contradiction exactly, but something more complicated than that. And then, in 2015, everything took a darker turn. His on and off relationship with Catriona White ended in tragedy when she died. It wasn't just a loss, it was a moment that seemed to stop everything around it. His response carried a kind of quiet shock, describing her as someone gentle, someone deeply sensitive, someone whose presence had left a mark that couldn't be easily explained. But even that moment didn't remain private. It unfolded into something more public, more complicated. In 2016, legal action was brought against him by her estranged husband and mother, accusing him of playing a role in her death by providing substances despite knowing her struggles. It turned grief into conflict, forcing everything into the open in a way that stripped away any sense of distance. Carrey pushed back, rejecting the claims completely, seeing them as an attempt to take advantage of something deeply painful. And by 2018, the case was dismissed, bringing a legal end to a situation that had already left its mark. The glitch in the Matrix. Decoding the new Jim Carrey. For someone known for comedy, Jim Carrey has always had another side that doesn't stay neatly in one lane. Because when the cameras fade and the performances end, he doesn't just switch off, he changes. And over time, that change has taken him into places that feel far removed from the version of him most people think they know. At one point, that change turned inward, away from film sets and scripts, and into something quieter: painting. What started as a form of therapy slowly became something more deliberate, more expressive, almost like another language he could use when words didn't quite carry what he meant. And the surprising part wasn't just that he painted, it was that he was good at it. But even that didn't stay simple for long. By 2018, his artwork had taken on a sharper edge. The canvases weren't just personal anymore, they were pointed, political. He began creating portraits of high-profile figures, including Mark Zuckerberg and Donald Trump. But it was his depiction of Sarah Huckabee Sanders that drew the most attention. The piece didn't just provoke reactions, it split them. Some saw it as bold, even darkly humorous. Others saw something else entirely, accusing him of crossing a line, of turning satire into something more personal than it needed to be. And that tension, that willingness to step into uncomfortable territory, has followed him beyond the canvas. It showed up again in his brief involvement with Kick-Ass 2. At first, it looked like another unexpected but fitting move, a chance to step into a world that matched his intensity. During filming, there was no hesitation, no visible resistance to the film's violent tone. But then, something changed. In the aftermath of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, his perspective changed. The same material he had once been part of no longer sat the same way with him. And when the time came to promote the film, he stepped back, making it clear that he couldn't support that level of violence anymore. It didn't sit well with everyone involved. Some disagreed openly, but he didn't move from that position. And once again, it placed him slightly out of sync with the people around him. That pattern continued, this time in a way that reached far beyond film. During his relationship with Jenny McCarthy, Carrey became closely tied to one of the most controversial public debates at the time. Together, they pushed against vaccines, questioning their safety and promoting the widely disputed idea that they were linked to autism. It was a position that drew intense criticism, not just from the public, but from the scientific community, where the consensus remained clear and consistent. The backlash was immediate, and it didn't fade quickly. Still, stepping into controversy wasn't new for him. It was just taking a different form. Because when it came to performance, that same intensity didn't disappear. It deepened. Nowhere was that more visible than in his portrayal of Andy Kaufman. What started as a role quickly became something else entirely. He didn't just play Kaufman, he lived him, on set and off, staying in character to a degree that blurred the line between performance and reality. It pushed the people around him to their limits, creating tension that didn't always stay contained. The result on screen was undeniable, but behind the scenes, it came at a cost. And even years later, that sense of unpredictability hasn't completely left the conversation. It resurfaced again in a way no one quite expected, not through a performance, but through an appearance. When Carrey stepped onto the red carpet at the 51st César Film Awards in Paris, it should have been a straightforward moment. A rare public appearance, a Lifetime Achievement Award, a speech delivered in French after months of preparation. But almost immediately, something else took over. Online, the conversation moved from the award to his appearance. People began questioning what they were seeing, pointing out differences, searching for explanations that didn't always make sense. And then, just as quickly, the theories escalated. Claims of body doubles, of impersonations, of something not quite real. The situation intensified when special effects artist Alexis Stone posted an image suggesting he had transformed into Carrey using prosthetics, adding fuel to something that was already spiraling. Even reactions from others in the industry reflected that uncertainty, with Megan Fox openly questioning what was real and what wasn't. But when the noise settled, the explanation was far less complicated. His representatives confirmed that he had been there in person. Event organizers backed it up, dismissing the speculation entirely. What people were reacting to wasn't a replacement or a trick. It was simply time, change, and a man who no longer looked exactly the way they remembered. Dave Chappelle speaks on Jim Carrey. And it's worse than we thought. Throughout his journey, Dave Chappelle never really chased Hollywood the way others did. He moved on his own terms, built his own rhythm, but along the way, there were still people he respected, comedians he looked up to, names that carried weight even for him. And one of those names was Jim Carrey. So when the chance came to meet him, it should have been simple. But it didn't play out that way. Chappelle met Carrey on the set of Man on the Moon, at a time when the film was deep in production. The introduction itself came through Norm Macdonald, which only made the moment feel more natural, more expected. Everything about it suggested a normal meeting. Except from the very beginning it wasn't, because Jim Carrey wasn't there. What stood in front of him was Andy Kaufman. Carrey wasn't halfway in character. He wasn't switching in and out between takes. He was fully inside it. The voice, the mannerisms, the presence, all of it locked in. And the strange part wasn't just him. It was everyone else. The crew had already adjusted. They spoke to him as Andy, referred to him as Andy, and treated the performance like it had replaced the person completely. So when Chappelle stepped into that space, he wasn't just meeting someone, he was stepping into a reality that had already been set. And it didn't sit right, because from where he stood, there was no confusion. He could see exactly who he was looking at. It was Jim Carrey. Clear, obvious. But at the same time, everything around him was asking him to ignore that and play along. And it didn't end quickly. It stretched into an entire afternoon of pretending. He later reflected on it with humor, but underneath that, the disappointment was still there. He had gone there to meet Jim Carrey, and instead, he spent hours talking to a character he didn't believe in, forced to act like something that didn't feel real to him. From his perspective, it was obvious the whole time. He was looking at Jim Carrey, but Jim refused to step out of it. And the truth is, that wasn't just a moment. That was the process. During Man on the Moon, Carrey stayed in character from start to finish. No breaks, no separation, no pause between scenes. And even he would later admit how far it went, describing the experience as something that pushed him completely out of himself, to the point where Jim Carrey, as a person, barely existed during that time. He saw it less as playing a role and more as losing himself to something that had already been defined by Kaufman's intensity. That shift didn't just stay with him, it affected the people around him too, because working with him didn't feel like working with an actor. It felt like dealing with something that didn't switch off, something that blurred the line so completely that even those closest to the project started to lose their sense of where Jim ended and the character began. That confusion carried over into how others experienced him during that time. Chris Smith, who later reflected on that period, described a similar feeling. Being around Carrey didn't bring clarity. It did the opposite. It made him realize how little he understood about who Jim actually was beneath everything. There were moments where glimpses of the real person came through, brief and almost grounding, but they didn't last. What stayed dominant was the character. And when you look back at that meeting with Chapelle, it stops feeling like just an awkward encounter. It becomes something else. A moment where admiration met reality, and reality didn't quite match what was expected. Because what Chapelle walked into that day wasn't just a performance. It was someone who had gone so far into a role, they didn't seem to come back out of it. What's your favorite Jim Carrey movie to this day? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.